These slides are created to explain the clinical application of temporal summation. The topics covered in this presentation shall be: what is temporal summation, what is the relationship between intensity and duration, how the concept of temporal summation is applied in the clinical context, and how to interpret the testing. The clinical application of temporal summation in different conditions and what are its limitations. These are the 5 topics that will be covered in today's presentation. We'll move on to our first topic, temporal summation. The integration of acoustic power over time is attributed to temporal summation in the auditory system, representing the ear's ability to unify energy within a time frame of approximately 1/3 of a second. Notice that the area of the rectangle is the same regardless of whether it's high and narrow, representing more intense and shorter in duration, or short and wide, representing less intense and longer duration. This is one quite good example of what temporal summation is. In order to understand the temporal summation, we need to understand the relationship that is there between intensity and duration. We can look that a 2 to 3 dB increase in intensity is required to hear stimuli shorten from 200 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds, same with 100 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds. Consequently, an 8 to 10 dB increase in intensity is needed for threshold response, as the stimulus duration decreases tenfold below 200 milliseconds. This will result in an integration slope of 8 to 10 dB for each decade change in stimulus duration. Keeping this in mind, we can see how this concept is applied in clinical context. Brief tone audiometry. Measure the threshold of tones that have very short duration. During this procedure, thresholds for acoustic stimuli of various durations are measured and compared. The testing is done by comparing the threshold for tones having 20 and 500 millisecond duration. And this is considered to be an efficient clinical approach that is given by Bright. Let us move on to the interpretation. As we can see, the first part, the A part, clearly explains how the concept of temporal summation will be in a normal hearing and in a cochlear impaired ear. Testing at 20 and 500 milliseconds will help in distinguish between normal and cochlear impaired ear. This graph showing trade-off where a 10-time change in duration can be balanced by a complementary 10 dB change in intensity, meaning that if the duration of a sound increases by a factor of 10, the intensity can decrease by 10 dB to maintain the same perceptual impact and vice versa. This relationship highlights the inverse proportionality between the duration and intensity of a sound in auditory perception. The temporal integration function is typically shallower with normal hearing when compared with cochlear impairment. Now we can look on what are its limitations and how this concept of temporal summation will react in other pathologies. If we move on to conductive hearing loss, individuals with conductive hearing loss perform similarly to those with normal hearing. With context to eighth nerve involvement, normal differences between thresholds for brief tonal stimuli of varying durations. Whereas for cochlear impairment, a smaller level change in cochlear may indicate recruitment. Though it's not very effective at distinguishing between cochlear and retrocochlear pathologies, early studies were hopeful, but later researchers showed too much overlap in results for these conditions, making it unreliable for diagnosis. This has been one of its limitations. It has low sensitivity for detecting retrocochlear pathology.